The laughter cut through the iron post bar like broken glass, sharp enough to draw blood if you listened close. It wasn't the good kind, the kind that comes after a long day when men gather to forget their troubles. This was the other kind, the kind designed to remind someone they didn't belong. Marcus Bennett sat at the far end of the bar, his flannel shirt faded at the shoulders where the fabric had given up trying to hold color. The sleeves were rolled to his elbows, exposing forearms marked with the kind of strength that comes from years of honest work. His hands rested around a glass of whiskey, ice shifting in the amber liquid like tectonic plates finding their fault lines. Grease lived under his fingernails despite the scrubbing, a permanent reminder of how he spent his days beneath car hoods and transmission pans. The men in the corner booth wore their success like armor, sharp suits that cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, watches that caught the dim bar light and threw it back like small victories. Their voices carried the confidence of people who had never wondered where next month's grocery money would come from. One of them, Derek Sullivan, leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him space. His voice rose above the classic rock bleeding from the speakers mounted in corners that had seen better decades. "Bet he's here for the free peanuts." Laughter rippled through the group, each man adding his contribution to the pile. "Probably came straight from fixing someone's dishwasher. Single dads don't build empires, they clean up after the ones who do." Marcus didn't turn, didn't flinch. His jaw stayed loose, his shoulders square and calm. He'd heard worse, survived worse, buried worse under the weight of years that taught him the difference between noise and truth. The whiskey touched his lips, went down smooth, and he set the glass back on scarred wood that had absorbed 1,000 stories just like this one. Across the bar, Sophia Garrett watched the scene unfold with the careful attention of someone trained to read rooms before entering them. She sat alone at a small table, a glass of red wine untouched in front of her, her tailored blazer and pressed slacks marking her as distinctly out of place in this blue-collar sanctuary. At 42, she'd learned to spot strength in unlikely packages, and something about the man at the bar held her attention the way a well-designed blueprint draws the eye to its load-bearing elements. He wasn't defending himself, wasn't performing dignity for an audience. He simply existed in his own gravity, unmoved by the mockery swirling around him like weather he'd learned to ignore. The cornerstone of any structure isn't the part everyone sees, it's the part that holds steady when everything else wants to fall. Tony, the bartender who'd been pouring drinks in this place since before the neighborhood remembered how to gentrify, slid a fresh bowl of peanuts toward Marcus without being asked. Some gestures don't require words. Marcus nodded once, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between men who understand economy of motion. The clock above the bar read 8:15. In 45 minutes, he'd drive home to relieve Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who watched Emma on nights when Marcus needed an hour to remember he was still human. In 45 minutes, he'd check his daughter's homework, make sure she'd brushed her teeth, and tuck her into bed with a kiss on her forehead that contained every promise he'd ever made. But right now, for these 45 minutes, he could sit in the noise and the dim light and pretend the weight on his shoulders belonged to someone else. Derek's group had moved on to louder topics, their attention span as short as their understanding of what it meant to build a life from rubble. Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket, thumbed it open to the photo that served as his home screen. Emma at 10 years old, gap-toothed and brilliant, holding up a science project she'd built from cardboard and dreams. Her smile could power cities. The alarm on his phone had gone off that morning at 5:30, the same time it went off every morning because discipline doesn't negotiate with tired bones. Marcus's feet hit the floor before the second ring, a habit carved so deep it no longer required conscious thought. The house on Maple Street was modest in the way that suggested careful budgets and deferred maintenance, but it was clean and it was theirs. Emma's lunch came together with the precision of architectural planning. Turkey sandwich cut into triangles because she insisted they tasted better that way. Some scientific principle about surface area and flavor distribution that she'd explained to him once, with the kind of certainty that made him believe in the future. Apple slices wrapped tight in plastic, a granola bar, a juice box, and on the lid of her lunchbox in permanent marker that had survived 2 years of daily use, his handwriting, "You got this, sweetheart." Below his words, a unicorn sticker she'd added when she was 8, already peeling at the edges, but neither of them had the heart to remove it. The coffee came black and hot because adding cream felt like admitting weakness to the morning. Marcus stood at the kitchen counter in the blue dark before sunrise and listened to the house settle around him, all its small creaks and groans a language he'd learned to speak. This was the hour when the world belonged to people who built things, fixed things, made things work. By 6:15 he had Emma up and moving through her routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that structure creates freedom. Breakfast, backpack check, hair brushed, shoes tied. The school bus pulled up at 7:05 and Emma climbed aboard with a wave that said she loved him without needing the words. Hayes Auto Repair sat on the east side of Portland where the real estate prices hadn't caught the fever that turned neighborhoods into investment portfolios. The building wore its age honestly, brick that had darkened with decades of weather, windows that had been replaced more than once, a hand-painted sign that Ray Cooper had touched up every few years when the sun faded it past recognition. Marcus pulled his truck into the lot at 7:30, 30 minutes before opening, because Ray kept the coffee hot and the garage door unlocked for the men who showed up early. Inside, the familiar smell of motor oil and metal filings mixed with something that might have been hope if you squinted hard enough at it. Ray looked up from the engine he was already elbow-deep in, a 1967 Mustang that had been in the shop longer than some marriages lasted. At 65, Ray moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had started sending invoices for all the years he'd asked it to bend and lift and strain. "Morning, son." Marcus nodded, grabbed a cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since Ray arrived at 6. They worked in comfortable silence for the first hour, the kind of quiet that only exists between men who trust each other's competence absolutely. Around 9, when the first customer of the day dropped off a Subaru with a check engine light that probably meant nothing and might mean everything, Ray straightened up and wiped his hands on a red shop rag. "You see things others miss," he said, not looking at Marcus directly, which was how Ray delivered anything that approached a compliment. "Always have." Marcus studied the Subaru's engine bay with the kind of attention most people reserved for holy texts. His eyes tracked lines and connections, saw patterns in the chaos of hoses and wires and metal that most mechanics learned to navigate by rote memory. But Marcus saw systems, saw how each component related to every other, saw where stress accumulated and where failures propagated and where a single weak point could cascade into catastrophic breakdown. "Vacuum leak," he said after 30 seconds. "Intake manifold gasket." Ray bent closer, found the wear pattern Marcus had spotted. "Damn, good catch." The day unfolded in its familiar rhythm. Oil changes and brake jobs and the endless small failures that kept internal combustion engines humble. Marcus moved through each task with precision that seemed outsized for work this simple, but precision was the only way he knew how to operate. Every bolt tightened to specification, every fluid level checked twice. Every customer treated with the kind of respect that assumed they mattered, because they did. Lunch came from the cooler Marcus packed each morning, eaten at the small desk in the corner of the garage that served as their office. Ray took his lunch across the street at the diner that had been there longer than either of them, a routine he'd maintained for 40 years and saw no reason to modify now. Marcus pulled out his phone while he ate, thumbed open the browser to a website most mechanics had never heard of. Architecture Now, a forum where the kind of people who cared about load-bearing calculations and environmental impact assessments gathered to discuss the future of urban development. He logged in under the username Structure First, a handle he'd been using for 8 years, ever since the night he'd realized he couldn't completely walk away from the profession he'd left behind. His most recent post had gathered 24 comments overnight, professionals from across the country weighing in on his analysis of a new mixed-use development in Seattle. The original poster had asked about foundation challenges for building on reclaimed waterfront. Marcus had written 3 paragraphs explaining soil compaction rates and lateral load distribution, and the long-term risks of ignoring tidal coefficients in structural calculations. User Steel and Stone replied, "Structure First always cuts to the heart of it. Whoever you are, you're wasted wherever you're working." Marcus closed the browser without responding. The compliment sat in his chest like a stone, heavy with the weight of everything he'd given up and everything he'd gained in the exchange. The afternoon brought a transmission rebuild that would take the rest of the week, and a customer who wanted to argue about whether his warranty covered a problem that absolutely was not covered by his warranty. Marcus let Ray handle the argument because Ray had 50 years of practice telling people things they didn't want to hear, and retreated to the bay where the Mustang waited with the patience of a machine that had nowhere else to be. By 5 o'clock, his back ached in the specific way that meant he'd been bent at bad angles too long. His hands were black with grease that would take 3 washings to approximate clean. His shirt carried stains that might be permanent. And in 45 minutes, he'd be sitting at the iron post with a whiskey, watching the ice melt, listening to men in expensive suits remind him that he didn't belong in their world. Except their world wasn't the one he wanted. The drive home took 15 minutes through streets that had been changing faster than Marcus could track. Coffee shops where hardware stores used to stand, boutiques selling things nobody needed in buildings that used to house things everybody did. Portland was growing into itself the way adolescents grow into their features, awkward and proud and not quite sure what it was becoming. Emma met him at the door with a backpack full of homework and a smile that could renovate condemned buildings. At 10 years old, she'd already developed the kind of focus that suggested she'd inherited more from him than just his dark hair and stubborn chin. "Mrs. Patterson made cookies," she announced, which explained the chocolate smell lingering in the kitchen. "And I finished my math worksheet before dinner." Marcus ruffled her hair, a gesture she was growing too old for but hadn't quite rejected yet. "Good. What else?" "Science project." She pulled a notebook from her backpack, flipped it open to reveal sketches that made Marcus's chest tighten with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite grief. Buildings, not the simple box and triangle houses that most 10-year-olds drew, but actual architectural renderings complete with annotations about solar orientation and water collection systems and green roofs designed to provide habitat for native bird species. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma looked at him with eyes that saw too much. "You showed me, remember? When we were working on that birdhouse last summer, you explained about load distribution and why the roof needed to overhang a certain amount for the rain." He didn't remember explaining it in those terms, but he supposed the language he used when teaching had never fully separated itself from the language he'd learned in classrooms that now felt like someone else's memories. They worked on the science project together after dinner, Emma's small hands sketching while Marcus guided her through principles of sustainable design that he'd once thought would define his career. Passive cooling, natural light harvesting, materials that worked with their environment instead of against it. "Dad," Emma said, her pencil pausing mid-stroke, "why do you work on cars instead of buildings?" The question landed clean, no malice in it. just curiosity about why the world was shaped the way it was. Because you needed someone who could pick you up from school, Marcus said, and architecture is a job that doesn't stop when you want it to. Emma nodded, satisfied with this explanation in the way children accept truths that adults spend years questioning. I'm glad you picked me up. After Emma went to bed, her teeth brushed and her stuffed rabbit tucked in beside her and her nightlight casting its small constellation across her ceiling, Marcus stood in the doorway and watched her breathe. In a world that had handed him more failure than success, more questions than answers, more weight than any reasonable person should be expected to carry, she was the one thing he'd gotten absolutely right. He found himself at his drafting table, the one piece of his old life he hadn't been able to surrender to practicality. It sat in the corner of his bedroom, a flat surface scarred with the marks of 1,000 projects that would never be built. Tonight he pulled out a sketchbook, flipped past pages of designs that represented roads not taken and started drawing. A building that didn't exist, that would never exist, but needed to exist in his mind the way some people needed to pray. His pencil moved across paper with muscle memory that hadn't forgotten how to translate vision into line and shadow. Load-bearing walls, foundation footings sized for soil compaction rates, window placement calculated for maximum natural light with minimum thermal transfer. Every element solving a problem, answering a question, making something better than it would have been without someone caring enough to think it through. The clock read 11:30 when he finally closed the sketchbook. In 7 hours, the alarm would sound and the whole cycle would begin again. Coffee, lunch, note on the lunchbox, kiss on the forehead, day beneath the hoods of cars that other people drove and broke and needed someone to fix. Some men build skyscrapers. He'd chosen to build a life. The Iron Post was busier than usual for a Thursday night when Marcus walked through the door at 8 o'clock. The after-work crowd had thinned but not disappeared, and the tables were scattered with people who'd found reasons to delay going home to wherever home was for them. Tony nodded from behind the bar, already reaching for the bottle of whiskey that Marcus never needed to order. Marcus took his usual stool at the far end, the one with the slight wobble that nobody had gotten around to fixing in the 3 years he'd been coming here. The whiskey arrived in a clean glass with 2 cubes of ice, and Marcus wrapped his hands around it like it might contain answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. That's when Derek Sullivan's voice cut through the ambient noise and the laughter started, and Marcus decided that tonight he could absorb their mockery the same way good insulation absorbs sound. Let it hit him and die there, converted into heat he could dispose of later when nobody was watching. He was halfway through his drink when someone sat down on the stool next to him. "Is this seat taken?" Marcus looked up to find a woman in a tailored blazer that probably cost more than his truck payment, her copper-colored hair pulled back in a way that suggested both professionalism and the kind of control that came from years of refusing to let the world push her around. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that missed nothing, and they were studying him with an intensity that made him want to check if his shirt was on backwards. "It's yours," he said. Sophia Garrett ordered a glass of red wine and settled onto the stool with the posture of someone who'd learned to command rooms just by existing in them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and Marcus appreciated that she didn't feel the need to fill silence with words that meant nothing. Finally, she said, "I didn't expect to see you back here." "I didn't expect to come back," Marcus admitted. "But sometimes you find yourself returning to places that feel honest." As she smiled, a small thing that softened the sharp edges of her face. "The Iron Post isn't much, but what you see is what you get. That's rare." They fell into conversation the way some people fall into water, with less intention than momentum. She asked what he did for a living, and he told her about Hayes Auto, about the satisfaction that came from solving mechanical puzzles that had right answers and wrong answers with no gray area in between. She told him about the real estate development company she'd built over the past decade, about the challenge of trying to create spaces that served communities instead of just extracting profit from them. "You know anything about architecture?" she asked after her second glass of wine, the question casual but her eyes suddenly more focused. Marcus shrugged. "Construction background. You pick up things." She mentioned a building downtown, the Brennan Tower, a new mixed-use development her company had opened 6 months ago. Something in the way she said it suggested the building carried weight beyond its physical presence. "Western exposure with minimal overhang," Marcus said, the analysis coming automatically. "I bet the thermal efficiency is a disaster, probably running air conditioning overtime by 3 in the afternoon." Sophia's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. She set it down carefully, her full attention now locked on him like a targeting system that had just identified something unexpected. "That's exactly the problem we're fixing right now," she said slowly. "Retrofit air handling units on every floor because the original design didn't account for solar gain." "How did you know that?" Marcus realized he'd said too much, let his actual knowledge slip past the careful boundaries he'd built around his past. "Just an educated guess based on what I've seen around the city. Construction workers don't talk about solar gain coefficients," Sophia said, not aggressive, just stating a fact that demanded explanation. "They talk about whether the AC works or doesn't." He took a drink of whiskey to buy himself time to decide how much truth to offer. "I used to work in the field. You see enough buildings go up, you learn what works and what doesn't." She didn't push, but he could see her filing the information away for later examination. They talked for another hour, the conversation moving from architecture to coffee preferences to the inexplicable superiority of sandwiches cut into triangles instead of rectangles. Marcus found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't around another adult in longer than he could remember. Sophia told him about her father, a contractor who'd taught her to read blueprints before she learned to read chapter books, who'd died 5 years ago from a heart attack on a job site because he'd ignored the chest pains for 3 days rather than admit weakness. "He taught me that spaces shape people as much as people shape spaces," she said. "That good design isn't about making things look impressive. It's about making them work for the humans who have to live in them." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant in a way that came from years of study and practice, that he couldn't acknowledge without opening doors he'd deliberately closed. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson. Emma was asking for him. "Time to go." "I should head out," he said, settling his tab with cash that Tony accepted with the same nod he'd given when Marcus arrived. "Will I see you here again?" Sophia asked. "Probably," Marcus said. "It's become a habit." Over the next 3 weeks, the habit intensified. Marcus and Sophia found themselves at the Iron Post most nights, their conversations deepening from surface pleasantries into the kind of exchanges that happen when two people discover they speak the same language, even if they learned it in different classrooms. She told him about the pressure of running a company in an industry that still questioned whether women belonged in leadership, about the constant balancing act between maintaining ethical standards and meeting investor expectations. He told her about Emma, about the choice he'd made 8 years ago when his wife Sarah had walked out claiming she'd never signed up for motherhood, about rebuilding his entire life around the needs of a 2-year-old who deserved better than she'd been given. "You gave up your career for your daughter," Sophia said one night, and it wasn't a question. "I chose what mattered," Marcus corrected. "Architecture would still be there. Emma's childhood wouldn't wait." Sophia studied him with eyes that had learned to measure people the way architects measure spaces, looking for the load-bearing elements that kept everything else from collapsing. "You're not what you seem, Marcus Bennett. Neither are you, Sophia Garrett." The chemistry between them built slowly, carefully, like a foundation that understood the importance of settling before adding weight. Attraction was there, undeniable as gravity, but it stayed banked beneath layers of respect and shared understanding and the careful distance that people maintain when they've both been burned before. Emma asked about her one night after Marcus came home from the Iron Post smelling like bourbon and honest conversation. "Is that lady going to be my new mom?" Marcus sat down on the edge of her bed, his heart doing complicated things in his chest. "It's not like that, sweetheart. We're just friends. Friends who see each other every night. 10 years old and already too smart for comfortable lies. She's someone who understands things about me that most people don't," Marcus said carefully. "That's rare. Worth protecting." Emma nodded, satisfied with this truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "I like that you have friends, Dad. You work too hard to not have friends." A father's greatest blueprint isn't drawn on paper. It's built in moments nobody sees, in conversations at bedtime and promises kept and love demonstrated through the architecture of daily choice. The night everything changed started the same as the previous dozen. Marcus arrived at the Iron Post at 8 o'clock to find Sophia already there, but tonight the bar was more crowded than usual. The corner booth that Derek Sullivan's group usually occupied had expanded to include 2 additional tables, and the noise level suggested celebration. Derek stood at the center of the gathering, his voice pitched to carry across the room like a politician addressing constituents who had no choice but to listen. "To Riverfront Commons," he announced, raising a glass of bourbon that probably cost more than Marcus made in a week. 600 luxury units on prime waterfront property. Fastest development timeline in company history. Groundbreaking in 30 days. The group erupted in cheers and clinked glasses, and Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Riverfront Commons, the old Cascade Mill site. He knew that land. 8 years ago, when he'd still been Marcus Bennett of Coleman and Fisher architectural firm, when his business cards had carried enough weight to open doors and start conversations, he'd been part of a team that surveyed that exact location for a different development group. They'd spent 3 months conducting soil analysis and environmental impact assessments and hydrological surveys that painted a picture nobody wanted to see. The soil was contaminated from decades of industrial chemical use. The riverbank was unstable, eroding at rates that would undermine any structure built too close to the water's edge. The seasonal flooding patterns created drainage challenges that would require millions in remediation before the site could safely support residential development. Coleman and Fisher had recommended against proceeding. The development group had walked away. The land had sat empty for the better part of a decade, waiting for someone desperate enough or ignorant enough to try again. Marcus turned to Sophia, saw her watching Derek's celebration with an expression he couldn't quite read. Pride, maybe, or concern, or the complicated mixture that came from building something while knowing all the ways it could fall apart. "You're developing the Cascade Mill site?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "It's our biggest project, 2 years in planning. Derek pushed it through city council approval last month." Marcus's hands tightened around his glass. He should stay quiet, should let it go. It wasn't his business anymore, hadn't been his business for 8 years, and getting involved would mean exposing parts of his past that he'd worked hard to keep buried. But the engineer in him, the architect who'd spent 6 years learning how to read soil reports and calculate load factors and understand the long-term consequences of building on compromised ground, couldn't stay silent. Derek's voice rose again, cutting through the bar's ambient noise. "And the best part, we cut through all that environmental red tape. 6 months of bureaucratic delay just vanished. Time is money, and we're about to make a fortune. That site has severe contamination issues," Marcus said, the words coming out before he could stop them, his voice pitched low but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The conversations around them dimmed. Derek turned, his politician's smile freezing into something harder. "Excuse me?" Marcus stood, moved toward the group with the calm deliberation of someone who knew exactly what he was walking into. "The Cascade Mill site. The soil has heavy metal contamination from industrial chemicals used in the paper mill. The riverbank is unstable, erodes significantly every spring. You can't build residential structures there without extensive remediation. Derek's smile sharpened into something predatory. And you know this how? From changing oil filters? I know it because I surveyed that land 8 years ago, Marcus said evenly. Coleman and Fisher. We spent 3 months documenting soil contamination levels, analyzing erosion patterns, measuring seasonal water table fluctuations. We recommended $12 million in remediation work as a minimum before any construction could proceed safely. The bar had gone quiet now, all attention focused on the confrontation unfolding between the man in the flannel shirt and the executive in the $1,000 suit. Derek laughed, but it sounded forced. That's ancient history. We commissioned updated environmental surveys from Tristar Engineering. Everything came back clean. Tristar Engineering, Marcus said, and something in his tone made it clear what he thought of that choice. They're known for producing developer-friendly results, known for minimizing risks and skipping the hard analysis when it might slow down a project. Sophia had moved closer, her phone out, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Marcus could see her pulling up documents, cross-referencing data, and he watched her expression shift as she found public records that confirmed what he was saying. Derek's confidence was cracking, small fissures appearing in the facade. You're just some mechanic with delusions of expertise trying to sabotage our project. I'm someone who knows that soil, Marcus said quietly. I know how the river undercuts the bank every spring when the snowmelt floods come down from Mount Hood. I know the chemical composition of the contamination and how it migrates through groundwater. I know that if you build 600 residential units on that site without proper remediation, within 5 years you'll start seeing foundation cracks, settling issues, and toxic exposure levels that will make those luxury condos uninhabitable. The silence that followed was total. Sophia's face had gone pale. She was staring at her phone screen like it had just revealed a betrayal she hadn't seen coming. When she looked up at Derek, her eyes carried the kind of cold fury that comes from discovering someone you trusted had been lying all along. The preliminary Coleman and Fisher survey is public record, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Filed with the city in 2016, it's all here. Every concern Marcus just outlined. You told me those issues had been resolved. Derek's expression shifted from confident to defensive in the space between heartbeats. We addressed them. The new surveys show contamination levels 20% lower than what Coleman and Fisher found, Sophia interrupted, which is statistically impossible unless someone paid for results they wanted instead of results that were accurate. The investors at the table were looking at each other now, pulling out their own phones, the celebration souring into something that tasted like due diligence delayed too long. Derek pointed at Marcus, his finger shaking slightly. You're going to regret this. I'll sue you for interference, for defamation, for every word that came out of your mouth tonight. You'd have to prove I was wrong first, Marcus said, and I'm not. Derek grabbed his coat and stormed toward the exit, his departure punctuated by the heavy thud of the iron post's door slamming behind him. The investors remained, their low conversations now focused on lawyers and liability and how much this mistake was going to cost. Sophia was still staring at her phone, her jaw tight with the effort of maintaining composure in public when what she wanted was to scream or crawl or burn something down. Finally, she looked at Marcus and he saw a dozen questions forming behind her eyes. Do you still have those Coleman and Fisher files? She asked. The complete survey data? Every soil sample analysis, every structural calculation, every environmental impact assessment. Marcus pulled out his own phone, started scrolling through cloud storage folders he hadn't opened in years. I can send them to you tonight. I need them, Sophia said. I need everything you have. Because if you're right, if Derek knew about these issues and buried them, then we're not just talking about construction delays. We're talking about criminal negligence. Marcus nodded, already compiling files, already preparing to hand over data that would prove he'd been more than just a mechanic, more than just the guy in the flannel shirt drinking whiskey at the end of the bar. The investors began leaving. Their celebration turned wake until only Marcus and Sophia remained in a corner of the iron post that suddenly felt much larger than it had minutes before. "Why did you speak up?" Sophia asked. "You could have stayed quiet. Let us make our mistake. It wasn't your problem." Marcus thought about Emma, about the families who would save for years to afford down payments on those luxury condos, about children who would grow up in homes that were slowly poisoning them from the foundation up. Because people would buy those homes, he said. They'd trust that someone had checked, that someone had cared enough to do it right. And in 5 years, when the cracks started appearing, when the doors stopped closing properly, when independent testing found contamination levels in their drinking water, those families would lose everything. He paused, met her eyes directly. "I couldn't let that happen if I could prevent it." Sophia studied him in the dim bar light, really looked at him for the first time since they'd met, and what she saw seemed to shift something fundamental in how she understood the man sitting next to her. "You're not what you seem, Marcus Bennett." "Neither are you, Sophia Garrett." She stood, gathered her things with movements that suggested she was already 3 steps ahead, already planning her next dozen moves in a chess game that had just gotten exponentially more complicated. "I need to call an emergency board meeting," she said. "Tomorrow morning. Can you be there?" Marcus thought about Ray and the garage and the oil changes scheduled for tomorrow. Thought about Emma and the promises he'd made about being the parent who showed up, who stayed, who never put anything before her. Then he thought about the foundation of every choice he'd made for 8 years, the principle that you don't build something meant to last if you ignore what's broken underneath it. "I'll be there," he said. Sophia nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, thank you, for caring enough to say something." After she left, Marcus sat alone at the bar with melting ice in an empty glass and the weight of consequences he'd just set in motion. Tony materialized with the bottle, poured 2 fingers without asking. "That was something," Tony said in his economical way. "Yeah," Marcus agreed. "You know what you just did?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I stopped being invisible." He drove home through streets that looked the same but felt different, like he'd crossed a border he hadn't known existed and couldn't go back across even if he wanted to. Mrs. Patterson was asleep on the couch when he arrived, and he woke her gently, paid her for the evening, and watched her shuffle home to the house next door where her porch light stayed on all night. Emma was asleep with her stuffed rabbit and her nightlight and her dreams that probably involved scientific principles she was still too young to name. Marcus stood in her doorway and watched her breathe and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his carefully constructed life, or the first honest choice in 8 years of hiding. Tomorrow he would go to a board meeting in a world he'd left behind. Tomorrow he would prove he was more than the man in the flannel shirt. Tomorrow everything would change in ways he couldn't predict and probably couldn't control, but tonight, in this moment, he was still just Emma's father. Still the mechanic who showed up on time and did the work and kept his promises. You can't build something to last if you ignore what's beneath it. True for buildings, true for lives. The principle held even when everything else was shifting. The boardroom occupied the 15th floor of the Garrett and Associates building, all glass and steel in the kind of minimalist design that suggested success didn't need decoration. Marcus arrived at 8:45 wearing khakis and a button-down shirt he'd ironed himself, feeling like an imposter in a play where everyone else had memorized their lines years ago. Sophia met him in the lobby, her expression carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night preparing for war instead of sleeping. "Thank you for coming," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested gratitude mixed with dread, like she'd asked him to help demolish a building they'd both been living in. The elevator climbed in scenes punctuated only by the soft mechanical hum of ascension. Marcus watched the floor numbers increment and tried to remember the last time he'd been in a corporate setting, the last time he'd worn anything other than work boots and clothes that could survive oil stains. 8 years felt like a different lifetime. The conference room was already occupied when they entered. 10 people in business attire, their laptops open, their coffee cups arranged like defensive positions. Derek sat at the far end of the table, his posture radiating controlled aggression. When he saw Marcus, something cold flickered across his face and died there. Margaret Wallace, the CFO, whose gray hair and sharp eyes suggested she'd survived corporate politics by learning to read balance sheets the way some people read tarot cards, gestured for Marcus to sit. "Mr. Bennett?" she began, her voice neutral in the way that suggested she was reserving judgment until evidence presented itself. "Ms. Garrett has shared your concerns about the Riverfront Commons site. We've spent the morning reviewing the documentation you provided. I think it's fair to say we have questions." Marcus opened his laptop, pulled up the files he'd compiled from archives that should have stayed buried. Soil sample analysis, contamination mapping, hydrological surveys showing seasonal water table fluctuations that would compromise any foundation system not specifically engineered to account for them. For the next hour, he walked them through the data with the precision of someone who'd spent 6 years learning how to translate technical complexity into language that decision-makers could understand. He showed them contamination levels that exceeded EPA thresholds by factors that made liability lawyers nervous. He demonstrated erosion patterns that would undermine structural integrity within a decade. He explained how Tristar Engineering's survey had cherry-picked sample locations and ignored seasonal variations in a way that produced optimistic results disconnected from reality. Derek interrupted twice, trying to discredit the data as outdated, trying to suggest that Marcus's expertise was suspect. But the numbers didn't care about credentials or job titles, and Margaret Wallace had spent 30 years learning how to distinguish between facts and convenient fictions. "The liability exposure is catastrophic," she said when Marcus finished. "If we proceed with construction using the current foundation design, we're looking at structural failures within 5 to 7 years. Class action lawsuits, potential criminal charges for knowingly building on contaminated land without disclosure." Derek's jaw tightened. "We can still proceed. Modified timeline, additional remediation. The project is salvageable." "At what cost?" Margaret pulled up a spreadsheet that must have been prepared during Marcus's presentation. Preliminary estimates put proper soil remediation at $18 million. Foundation redesign adds another $6 million. Timeline extends by at least 14 months. We've already sold 200 pre-construction units based on promises we can't keep. The room absorbed this information like soil absorbing toxins, slowly, with consequences that wouldn't be visible until much later. Sophia spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "I'm recommending we halt all construction activities immediately. Full stop until we can develop a comprehensive remediation plan that actually addresses the site conditions instead of pretending they don't exist." Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping against polished floor. "You're destroying this company. This project represents 40% of our annual revenue projections. The investors will crucify us." "The investors will appreciate not going to prison," Margaret said dryly. The board voted, 7-3 in favor of halting construction, with Derek and 2 others dissenting on grounds that proved they valued short-term profit over long-term survival. Marcus watched the vote happen and felt the weight of consequence settling across his shoulders, like a coat he couldn't remove. After the meeting dissolved, Sophia caught his arm in the hallway. "Walk with me." They took the elevator to the ground floor, exited onto Portland streets where morning traffic was building toward its daily crescendo of honking and frustration. Sophia walked without apparent destination and Marcus followed, understanding that sometimes people needed motion to process thoughts too heavy to carry while standing still. Derek knew, she said finally. He had to have known. Tristar Engineering doesn't make mistakes this fundamental by accident. Someone told them what results to produce. Marcus nodded. The evidence pointed that direction, though proving it would require documentation that Derek had probably been careful to destroy. I built this company on the principle of ethical development, Sophia continued, on doing things right even when cutting corners would be cheaper. And my own partner has been undermining that from the inside. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her expression shifted into something Marcus couldn't read. I have to go. Emergency meeting with our attorneys. Can we talk tonight, the Iron Post? I'll be there. Marcus returned to Hayes Auto by 10:30 where Ray was already deep into the Mustang's transmission, and 3 customers were waiting for services that should have started an hour ago. He changed into his work clothes without explanation and dove into the backlog, letting the familiar rhythm of mechanical repair settle his mind. Lunchtime brought Emma's school calling. She'd been in a fight which was so out of character that Marcus's first reaction was to assume they had the wrong student. But no. Emma Bennett, 10 years old, had pushed another girl during recess after some argument nobody could quite explain. Marcus arrived at the principal's office to find Emma sitting with her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between defiant and terrified. The other girl's mother was already there, dressed in expensive yoga pants and radiating the kind of outrage that came from never having been told no. Your daughter assaulted my Madison, the woman declared, as if assault was the appropriate term for a shoving match between 5th graders. The principal, a tired woman named Mrs. Hendricks who'd probably dealt with worse conflicts before lunch, gestured for everyone to sit. Emma's story came out in fragments. Madison had been making fun of someone's dad, saying he was probably too poor to afford real clothes, that single parents were basically charity cases the rest of them had to tolerate. Emma had told her to stop. Madison had gotten louder. Emma had pushed her. Marcus looked at his daughter and saw himself in the defiance, saw Sarah in the quick temper, saw something entirely Emma in the refusal to let injustice stand unchallenged. She was being mean, Emma said, her voice small but steady, and nobody else was saying anything. The principal suspended both girls for the rest of the day, which seemed like justice designed to offend everyone equally. Marcus drove Emma home in silence that stretched between them like a bridge under too much weight. Finally, Emma spoke. I'm sorry I got in trouble. I'm not mad about the fight, Marcus said carefully. I'm concerned about what pushed you to it. You've been stressed lately, more than usual. Emma stared out the window at Portland rolling past, buildings and trees and people whose problems probably felt smaller than hers did right now. Kids at school say things, she said, about how we live, about how you're just a mechanic and their dads are doctors and lawyers and tech executives, about how I probably won't amount to anything because single-parent kids don't. Marcus felt something crack in his chest, felt the careful architecture of protection he'd built around Emma reveal its fundamental inadequacy. Those kids are wrong, he said, about all of it. What I do for a living doesn't define your worth any more than their parents' money defines theirs. I know, Emma said. Emma, but knowing it doesn't make it not hurt. They spent the afternoon together, Emma doing homework at the kitchen table while Marcus prepared dinner and tried to figure out how to shield his daughter from a world that measured people by the wrong metrics. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Sophia, updates about investor calls and attorney consultations, and Derek's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage the riverfront project by any means necessary. By the time Mrs. Patterson arrived at 7, Marcus felt like he'd lived 3 days in the span of 12 hours. The Iron Post was quieter than usual when he arrived. Sophia was already there, occupying their usual spot, but her expression carried news that wasn't good. "Derek's fighting back," she said without preamble. "He's claiming the Coleman and Fisher data is outdated and irrelevant. Says we're letting one disgruntled ex-architect sabotage millions in development because of personal vendetta." Marcus absorbed this. "It's not personal. I know that. The board knows that. But Derek's got investors calling, threatening to pull funding if we don't proceed. He's painting you as the villain in this story." Before Marcus could respond, the door opened and a woman walked in, who made his entire world tilt on its axis. Sarah Bennett looked different than she had 8 years ago. Older, obviously, but also more polished, more put together, like she'd finally grown into the life she'd always wanted and hadn't been able to achieve while playing house with a husband and daughter she'd never asked for. She saw Marcus and crossed the bar with purpose, her heels clicking against worn floor like a countdown to detonation. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying the same certainty it had the night she'd left, the same unwavering conviction that what she wanted mattered more than what anyone else needed. Marcus stood slowly, aware of Sophia watching, aware of every eye in the bar turning toward the confrontation developing in real time. "Not here," he said. "Yes, here, because I've been calling you for 3 days and you haven't answered." He checked his phone, found missed calls from an unknown number that his instincts had correctly identified as trouble he didn't need. "What do you want, Sarah?" She pulled papers from her purse, set them on the bar between them like evidence in a trial he didn't know he was attending. "I want my daughter back. I'm filing for primary custody." The words landed clean, surgical, designed to cut where they'd do the most damage. Marcus felt the room recede, felt the careful foundation of his life develop cracks that would propagate faster than he could repair them. "You left," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You walked away when she was 2 years old because you didn't want to be a mother." "I was young and scared and made a mistake," Sarah said, her tone suggesting she'd rehearsed this speech. "I've spent 8 years becoming the person I should have been. I'm remarried now, stable home, financial security. I can give Emma opportunities you never could." Marcus's hands clenched into fists that wanted to hit something but wouldn't because violence had never solved problems that required surgical precision to dismantle. "She doesn't know you. You're a stranger who shares her DNA." Sarah's expression hardened. "Which is why I'm asking for shared custody initially. Transition period. But Marcus, look at your life. You're bouncing between careers, working all hours, leaving her with babysitters." "My attorney says we have a strong case that Emma deserves stability." "I gave her stability," Marcus said, each word costing him something he couldn't afford to spend. "I gave her 8 years of showing up, of being there when she was sick, of helping with homework and attending school plays and making sure she knew that someone chose her every single day." "And I appreciate that," Sarah said in a tone that suggested she didn't. "But children need mothers. Courts recognize that." She left the custody papers on the bar, walked out without looking back, and Marcus stood there with the ruins of his carefully constructed life spreading at his feet like contaminated soil that nobody had warned him about until it was too late to remediate. Sophia touched his arm. "Marcus?" He picked up the papers, read legal language that translated his entire existence into inadequacy. Court date set for 6 weeks from now. Petition for shared custody with intent to pursue full custody based on evidence of career instability and inability to provide adequate parental supervision. "I need to go," he said. "Let me help. I know attorneys who specialize in family law." But Marcus was already moving toward the door, already running calculations about how much fight he had left in him and whether it would be enough to protect the one thing that mattered more than breath. Ray found him at the garage at midnight, working on the Mustang's transmission with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was trying to fix something that couldn't be repaired with socket wrenches and determination. "Heard about Sarah," Ray said, because bad news traveled fast in communities small enough to care. Marcus didn't stop working. Couldn't stop because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking down in ways he couldn't afford. She's going to take Emma. Ray lowered himself onto a rolling stool, his joints protesting the movement. Is she? She's got money, stability, a husband who probably makes 6 figures. What do I have? Grease under my fingernails and a job that pays the bills if I'm lucky. You've got 8 years of being her father, Ray said. You've got every school morning and bedtime story and moment of actually giving a damn. That counts for something. Not in court, not when they measure parenting by income brackets and career trajectories. Ray was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd lived long enough to know which battles were worth fighting. You're giving up before you've started. That's not the man I know. Marcus finally stopped working, set down the wrench, turned to face his mentor. What if she's right? What if Emma would be better off in a stable home with 2 parents and money for college and all the opportunities I can't provide? Better off without the father who rebuilt his entire life around her? Without the man who taught her that integrity matters more than comfort? Ray shook his head. You're smarter than that, son, or you used to be. The fight drained out of Marcus all at once, leaving exhaustion in its place. I'm scared, Ray. More scared than I've been since the night Sarah left. Good. Fear means you understand what's at stake. Now figure out what you're going to do about it. Marcus drove home through empty streets, found Mrs. Patterson asleep on the couch again, paid her and sent her home. Emma was awake in her bed, her nightlight casting shadows that moved like living things across walls covered with her artwork and science diagrams. Dad? He sat on the edge of her bed. Yeah, sweetheart? Mrs. Patterson said a lady came by earlier. She said she was my mom. Marcus's chest constricted. What did you tell her? That my mom left a long time ago and I don't really remember her. Emma's voice was small, uncertain in ways that 10-year-olds shouldn't have to be. She wants to see me, doesn't she? Lying would have been easier, but Marcus had built their relationship on foundations of truth even when truth hurt. She's asking the court for the right to spend time with you, to be part of your life. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Do I have to? I don't know yet. We'll figure it out together. I don't want to live with her, Dad. I want to stay here with you. Marcus pulled her into a hug that contained every promise he'd ever made and every fear he'd never voiced. Being a father isn't about DNA. It's about every 5:30 alarm, every lunch note, every promise kept. The next morning, Marcus called the number on the business card Sophia had given him, reached an attorney named Patricia Greenwood who specialized in custody cases and had a reputation for winning fights that looked unwinnable on paper. They met at her office, a converted Victorian in Northwest Portland where the furniture was expensive, but worn in ways that suggested function over form. Patricia was 50-something with gray hair she didn't bother dyeing and eyes that had seen enough courtroom drama to be unimpressed by anything short of genuine crisis. She read Sarah's petition with the careful attention of someone examining a blueprint for structural weaknesses. This is aggressive, she said finally. Alleging career instability, inadequate supervision, inability to provide opportunities. They're building a narrative that you're failing as a parent. I'm not failing, Marcus said. I believe you. But belief doesn't win custody cases. Evidence does. Patricia leaned back in her chair. Tell me about your career changes. Why did you leave architecture for auto repair? Marcus explained. The late nights at Coleman and Fisher that bled into early mornings, the deadlines that didn't care about daycare pickup times, the choice between professional advancement and being the parent Emma deserved. So you sacrificed career advancement for your daughter's well-being, Patricia summarized. That's actually a compelling narrative if we frame it correctly. But Sarah's attorney will argue that now you're trying to return to architecture, proving that your priorities are unstable. I'm consulting on one project, Marcus protested, 2 days a week while maintaining my primary job. Patricia made notes with a fountain pen that probably cost more than his truck payment. We'll need documentation, every parent-teacher conference, every medical appointment, every school event. We need to prove that despite career changes, you've been consistently present in Emma's life. Marcus thought about the boxes in his closet, the files he'd kept meticulously because organization was the only way he knew how to function. 8 years of documentation that proved he'd shown up even when showing up was the hardest thing he could do. I have everything. Good. We'll need testimony from teachers, neighbors, anyone who can speak to your parenting, and we'll need to be prepared for them to attack your current living situation, your income, your support system. Emma doesn't want to go with Sarah, Marcus said. She barely remembers her. Patricia's expression softened slightly. At 10 years old, courts will consider her preference but won't let it be the deciding factor. We need to build an airtight case that staying with you is in her best interest regardless of what material advantages Sarah can offer. Marcus left the meeting with a list of tasks that felt like preparing for battle, which he supposed he was. Gather documentation, secure witnesses, prepare for a fight that would determine whether the past 8 years of sacrifice meant anything to a judge who'd never met either of them. Ray gave him the time he needed without questions. Understood that some things mattered more than transmission rebuilds and oil changes. Marcus spent 3 days compiling evidence of his parenting, photographs and school reports and medical records that painted a picture of a father who'd been present for every moment that counted. Emma's science teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, agreed to testify. So did Mrs. Patterson and the school counselor and the pediatrician who'd treated Emma since she was 3. Each conversation reinforced what Marcus already knew but needed others to validate. He'd been a good father, maybe not perfect but present and committed and loving in ways that transcended income brackets and career titles. Sophia called on the 4th day with news that pulled him back into the riverfront crisis he'd temporarily forgotten about. Derek's escalating, she said. He's been feeding information to Sarah's attorney, documenting your hours at our office, photographing you working late, building a case that you're neglecting Emma to pursue architecture again. Marcus felt fury settle in his bones like frost. He's using my daughter as leverage? Worse, he's telling Sarah's attorney that you're unstable, that the stress is affecting Emma, that she's been acting out at school. He's building their case for them. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Derek needed Marcus discredited, needed him to disappear from the riverfront project so the development could proceed without inconvenient questions about soil contamination and environmental liability. And if destroying Marcus's custody case accomplished that goal, Derek wouldn't hesitate. What do we do? Sophia's voice hardened into something that reminded Marcus why she'd built a company from nothing in an industry designed to exclude her. We fight back. I'm calling a full board review of Derek's conduct, every decision he made on Riverfront, every communication with Tristar Engineering. If he buried evidence of contamination, if he knowingly put future residents at risk, I'm going to make sure the consequences land exactly where they belong. The board review happened 3 days later in the same conference room where Marcus had first presented his evidence. This time, the atmosphere was different, charged with the kind of tension that precedes corporate executions. Margaret Wallace had spent 72 hours conducting an investigation that revealed what everyone had suspected but nobody had proven. Derek had received Tristar Engineering's preliminary report showing contamination levels that exceeded safety thresholds. He'd sent it back with instructions to retest using different methodologies that would produce lower numbers. When Tristar complied, Derek had buried the original report and presented only the sanitized version to the board, email evidence. Document trails, a pattern of deliberate deception that would have made defense attorneys weep. Derek sat at the table with his lawyer, his expression carved from stone, watching his career disintegrate in real time. "You knew," Sophia said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You knew that site was contaminated and you pushed the project through anyway because you didn't want delays affecting your bonus structure." Derek's lawyer started to speak, but Derek cut him off. "I made business decisions based on available information and professional judgment about acceptable risk levels." "You falsified environmental reports," Margaret corrected. "You knowingly misrepresented site conditions to investors and pre-construction buyers. You've exposed this company to criminal liability. And you used confidential company information to interfere with Marcus Bennett's custody case," Sophia added, "feeding ammunition to his ex-wife's attorney as retaliation for him exposing your negligence." Derek's composure cracked slightly. "Bennett is the one who should be investigated. Jumping between careers, neglecting his daughter, trying to relive his glory days by inserting himself into projects he has no business touching." Marcus had been sitting quietly until that moment, but something in Derek's words triggered a response he couldn't contain. "I left architecture because my daughter needed a father who could pick her up from school," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 8 years of choice and consequence. "You're trying to destroy my family because I had the integrity to tell the truth about your mistakes. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." The room fell silent. Margaret spoke with the finality of someone delivering a verdict that couldn't be appealed. "Mr. Sullivan, your employment with Garrett and Associates is terminated effective immediately. We'll be cooperating fully with any regulatory investigations into the Riverfront project. I strongly suggest you retain separate legal counsel." Derek stood, gathered his things with movements that suggested he was operating on autopilot while his mind processed the magnitude of his fall. At the door, he turned back, looked at Marcus with something that might have been regret if it wasn't buried under so many layers of bitterness. "You'll end up like me," he said. "Principles don't pay bills. You'll learn that eventually." Marcus met his eyes. "Or maybe you'll learn that some things matter more than money, but I doubt it." After Derek left, Sophia pulled Marcus aside. "We need to completely reimagine Riverfront, not just remediation, a fundamental redesign that turns the contamination into an opportunity instead of a liability." Marcus thought about Emma's science project, about buildings that worked with their environment instead of against it. "What if we made the remediation part of the development's identity?" he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "Instead of hiding the contamination, we showcase the cleanup process, living foundation systems that actively remediate soil while supporting structures. Educational components about environmental restoration. Turn the site into a demonstration of regenerative architecture." Sophia's eyes brightened with the kind of recognition that happens when someone hears their own half-formed thoughts articulated clearly. "Renewal at Riverfront," she said. "Not just building on damaged land, healing it." They spent the next week developing the concept. Marcus pulled Emma into the planning, let her contribute ideas about water gardens and native plant integration that would accelerate bioremediation. Her science teacher got involved, saw opportunities for environmental education partnerships. The project evolved from a liability into something unprecedented, but the custody case still loomed like a storm front that had been building while Marcus focused on other battles. Sarah's attorney filed an emergency motion claiming that Marcus's increased involvement with Garrett and Associates proved he was prioritizing career over Emma. They had photographs of him leaving the office late, testimony from school officials about Emma's behavioral issues, a narrative that painted Marcus as a man whose instability was damaging his daughter's development. Patricia Greenwood prepared their defense with the methodical precision of someone who'd fought this fight before. Documentation of Marcus's parenting, testimony from Emma's teachers praising his involvement. evidence that Emma's acting out stemmed from stress about her mother's sudden reappearance, not neglect from her father. The preliminary hearing happened on a Tuesday morning in family court, a building that smelled like recycled air and broken promises. Sarah sat with her attorney looking polished and put together. Her husband, a software executive named Richard who wore his success like a badge, sat beside her radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having struggled for anything. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Henderson who'd probably seen every variation of family dissolution, reviewed the filings with an expression that gave nothing away. Sarah's attorney went first, painting a picture of a mother who'd made a mistake but had spent 8 years becoming the person her daughter deserved. Stable home, financial security, educational opportunities, everything Marcus couldn't provide. Patricia countered with 8 years of documentation, every parent-teacher conference Marcus attended while Sarah was building her new life. Every medical appointment, every school play, every moment of showing up when it would have been easier to walk away. Emma's teacher testified. Mr. Bennett is the most involved parent I've worked with in 15 years of teaching. Emma's recent behavioral issues correlate directly with her mother's reappearance, not with any neglect from her father. Mrs. Patterson testified. I've watched that man raise that girl with more love than most two-parent households provide. He works hard, but he's never put work before Emma. Never. The judge listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that her decisions would shape lives in ways that couldn't be undone. Finally, she spoke. I'm denying the emergency custody motion. Mr. Bennett has demonstrated consistent, engaged parenting. Career evolution doesn't constitute instability, particularly when that evolution was motivated by prioritizing his daughter's needs. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, relief flooding through spaces that had been constricted by fear for weeks. But the judge wasn't finished. However, I'm ordering a full custody evaluation to be completed over the next 60 days. Ms. Bennett has a right to pursue a relationship with her daughter. We'll reconvene after the evaluation to determine an appropriate custody arrangement. 60 days, 2 months of social workers examining every corner of his life, of Emma being questioned about her preferences, of uncertainty that would hang over everything like contaminated soil waiting to poison whatever grew there. Marcus drove Emma home from school that afternoon, the court victory feeling hollow despite Patricia's assurances that they'd won the first battle. Emma was quiet until they pulled into the driveway. Dad, do I have to see her? The judge said we need to try. Supervised visits, just a few hours to start. What if I don't want to? Marcus killed the engine, turned to face his daughter. Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But Emma, I need you to understand something. No matter what happens with the court stuff, you're my daughter. That doesn't change based on what some judge decides, or what your mother wants. I chose you when you were 2 days old, and I'm still choosing you now. Emma nodded, tears tracking down her face, and Marcus pulled her into a hug that contained every promise he'd ever made and every fear he'd never spoken. That night, after Emma was asleep, Marcus sat at his drafting table and opened the riverfront redesign plans. The living foundation system that would turn contaminated land into healing ground. The water gardens that Emma had helped design. The educational center that would teach future generations about environmental responsibility. It was ambitious, unprecedented, exactly the kind of project that could redefine how people thought about urban development and environmental restoration. It was also the kind of project that would demand time and energy and attention he wasn't sure he could spare while fighting for custody of his daughter. Sophia called at 11, her voice carrying exhaustion that matched his own. The board approved the renewal concept, full funding. You'd be lead consultant on foundation design. It's everything we talked about. Marcus should have felt triumph, should have felt validation for every principle he'd refused to compromise. Instead, he felt the weight of impossible choices settling across his shoulders. "I need to step back," he said. "The custody evaluation, Emma's stress, everything with Sarah. I can't do both." Sophia was quiet for a long moment. "What if you didn't have to choose?" "Everyone has to choose eventually. Not if we structure this correctly, flexible hours, remote work options. Emma could even be involved in the educational programming. We make your family part of the project instead of competing with it." Marcus wanted to believe it was possible, wanted to think he could have both the work that fed his soul and the daughter who defined his purpose. But experience had taught him that wanting something didn't make it real. "I'll think about it," he said, which they both knew meant no. After hanging up, Marcus pulled out the boxes of documentation he'd compiled for the custody case. 8 years of being present, of showing up, of choosing Emma over everything else that competed for his attention. Some men build skyscrapers. He'd chosen to build a life. That choice had cost him his career, his marriage, his connection to work that used to define him. Now he was being asked to choose again, but the stakes had changed. Walking away from Riverfront meant abandoning principles he'd fought to protect. It meant letting Derek's corruption win. It meant missing the opportunity to build something that could actually matter. But fighting for the project meant giving Sarah's attorney ammunition about priorities and divided attention. It meant risking the custody evaluation. It meant potentially losing Emma. The choice shouldn't have been difficult. Emma mattered more than any building, any principle, any professional validation. Yet Marcus sat at his drafting table until dawn broke across Portland's skyline, drawing buildings that would never exist while the daughter he'd die to protect slept in the next room, and wondered if maybe the strongest foundations were the ones that bore weight from every direction without choosing which pressure mattered most. The custody evaluator arrived on a Thursday morning when rain was turning Portland's streets into mirrors that reflected a city Marcus barely recognized anymore. Dr. Helen Cartwright was 50-something with sensible shoes and a briefcase that probably contained forms designed to reduce human complexity into checkboxes and numerical scores. She sat in Marcus's living room and examined the space with eyes trained to spot dysfunction hidden beneath surface normalcy. The worn couch that Marcus had bought secondhand 8 years ago. The photographs covering one wall documenting Emma's growth from toddler to the edge of adolescence. The bookshelf holding children's novels alongside structural engineering textbooks that Marcus had never been able to discard. "Tell me about a typical day," Dr. Cartwright began, her pen poised over a notepad that would eventually become evidence in proceedings that would determine Emma's future. Marcus walked her through the 5:30 alarm and the lunch preparation, and the careful choreography of getting a 10-year-old ready for school while maintaining enough structure to create security without rigidity that would breed rebellion. He explained Hayes Auto and the consulting work with Garrett and Associates and how he'd been trying to balance both while keeping Emma at the center of every decision. And how does Emma feel about her mother's return? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading in directions Marcus couldn't control. Confused, scared, angry that someone who abandoned her thinks she can walk back in and claim mother status based on biology alone. Dr. Cartwright made notes that Marcus couldn't read upside down. Children often struggle with complex feelings about absent parents. Have you facilitated any contact between Emma and Ms. Bennett? The court ordered supervised visitation. We've had 2 sessions at a family center downtown. What Marcus didn't say was how those sessions had gone. Emma sitting rigid in a chair while Sarah tried to bridge 8 years of absence with questions about school and hobbies and favorite colors. The awkward silences that stretched between attempts at connection. The way Emma had cried in the car afterward, not because the visits were terrible, but because they were simply empty, devoid of the history and trust that made relationship possible. Dr. Cartwright spent an hour examining Marcus's documentation, the attendance records from school events, the medical files showing consistent preventive care, The photographs of birthday parties and science fairs and ordinary Tuesday evenings that proved presence wasn't about grand gestures but about showing up for the unremarkable moments that comprised actual life. "You've been very thorough," she observed in a tone that suggested thoroughness might itself be suspicious. Evidence of someone trying too hard to prove something that should be obvious. After she left, Marcus sat in the silence of his empty house and wondered how you proved love to someone whose job was skepticism. How you demonstrated that the architecture of family couldn't be measured by income or career stability, but by foundations built from accumulated moments of choosing to stay. Work on renewal at Riverfront was accelerating despite Marcus's reduced involvement. Sophia had assembled a team that believed in the vision of regenerative architecture, specialists in bioremediation and sustainable design who saw the contaminated site not as a liability but as an opportunity to demonstrate what was possible when developers prioritized healing over profit. Marcus attended meetings twice a week, contributed technical expertise on foundation systems that would support structures while actively cleaning the soil beneath them. Emma came with him sometimes, her presence tolerated by a team that had learned her insights about water flow and native plantings often solved problems the adults were overcomplicating. The project was gaining attention beyond Portland. Architecture journals were requesting interviews. Environmental groups were citing it as a model for brownfield redevelopment. Investors who'd fled when Derek's corruption became public were returning with enthusiasm for a development that actually stood for something beyond quarterly returns. But success brought scrutiny Marcus hadn't anticipated. Sarah's attorney filed supplemental motions claiming that Marcus's increased public profile proved he was exploiting Emma for professional advancement. They had photographs of her at the Riverfront site. Quotes from interviews where Marcus mentioned his daughter's contributions to the project design. A narrative that painted him as a father using his child's ideas to rebuild a career he'd abandoned, suggesting that Emma had become a tool rather than a priority. Patricia Greenwood called on a Friday afternoon with news that made Marcus's stomach drop. "They're escalating, claiming that your involvement with Garrett and Associates constitutes a return to the career patterns that made you unsuitable as a primary parent originally. They're arguing that if architecture was incompatible with single parenting 8 years ago, it remains incompatible now." "That's absurd. I left because the firm culture demanded 80-hour weeks. What I'm doing now is 2 days consulting with complete schedule flexibility." "I know that. You know that. But Sarah's attorney is framing it as evidence of instability, proof that you can't maintain consistent priorities." Marcus thought about the drafting table in his bedroom, about the buildings he'd drawn that would never be built, about the part of himself he'd buried for 8 years that was now demanding resurrection. "What do I do?" Patricia's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd fought this fight too many times. "You document everything, every hour with Emma, every decision that prioritizes her needs. You make the evaluator see that your involvement with Riverfront doesn't compete with parenting. It enhances it by showing Emma what it looks like to have principles and stand by them." The second custody evaluation session happened at Sarah's house in Seattle, a modern construction in a neighborhood where the median home price suggested Emma would never want for material comfort. Richard, Sarah's husband, greeted Marcus at the door with a handshake that felt like a challenge wrapped in corporate politeness. The house was everything Marcus's wasn't. Marble countertops and hardwood floors and furniture that matched in ways that suggested interior designers rather than accumulated necessity. Emma's room had already been prepared, painted in colors someone had decided a 10-year-old girl would like, filled with toys and books that had never been touched by the child they were meant to comfort. Dr. Cartwright observed as Sarah tried to engage Emma in conversation about the life they could build together. Piano lessons in private schools and summer camps in places Marcus couldn't afford to send postcards from. Emma listened with the polite attention of someone being offered gifts she hadn't asked for and didn't want. "What do you think, Emma?" Dr. Cartwright asked. About spending more time here with your mother? Emma's eyes found Marcus across the room, seeking permission or guidance, or maybe just reassurance that honesty wouldn't be punished. It's nice, she said carefully, but it's not home. Home is with my dad. Sarah's expression flickered with something that might have been hurt if it wasn't buried under so much determination. We could make it home together. You'd have your own space, opportunities your father can't provide. He provides everything that matters, Emma replied, her 10-year-old voice carrying conviction that made adults uncomfortable. The session ended with Dr. Cartwright making notes that would become part of the permanent record. Documentation that Emma preferred her father, but courts had to consider best interests that extended beyond a child's current wishes. Driving back to Portland, Emma stared out the window at landscapes that blurred with speed and rain. Dad, what happens if the judge makes me live with her? Marcus wanted to promise that wouldn't happen. Wanted to guarantee that justice would recognize 8 years of presence over 8 years of absence. But he'd learned that wanting something didn't make it true. We fight, he said instead. We show the court what our life actually looks like. We trust that truth matters. What if it doesn't? The question hung between them like contaminated soil, toxic and unavoidable and requiring remediation Marcus wasn't sure he knew how to perform. Then we figure out how to build something new from whatever pieces we're left with. Work became Marcus's refuge from custody anxiety he couldn't control. The renewal project demanded solutions to problems that had clear answers. Unlike family court, where evidence and logic seemed disconnected from outcomes, the living foundation system they were designing would use specialized concrete infused with bacteria that metabolized petroleum-based contaminants. Plant root systems integrated into the foundation structure would provide additional remediation while preventing erosion. The whole system would turn the building itself into an environmental restoration engine that would continue healing the site for decades after construction completed. Emma's water garden concept had evolved into a comprehensive stormwater management system that captured runoff, filtered it through native plantings, and returned clean water to the Willamette River. Educational signage would explain the process, turning the entire development into a living classroom about environmental stewardship. It was ambitious enough to be risky, innovative enough to be remarkable, and exactly the kind of project Marcus had once dreamed about building back when he thought changing the world was possible through better blueprints. Margaret Wallace approved budgets that made conservative board members nervous. Sophia defended the vision in investor meetings where people who measured success in quarterly returns struggled to understand development that defined success across generational timescales. We're not just building housing, Sophia explained at one contentious board meeting where 3 investors wanted to pull funding. We're proving that contaminated urban sites can become assets instead of liabilities. That developers can prioritize environmental healing without sacrificing profitability. That the right thing and the profitable thing don't have to be mutually exclusive. The investors stayed, persuaded by vision or shamed by implications that opposition meant valuing short-term profit over long-term responsibility. But success brought pressure that Marcus felt accumulating like seasonal floodwater testing foundation integrity. Dr. Cartwright scheduled interviews with Emma's teachers, her pediatrician, Mrs. Patterson, even Ray from the garage. Each conversation became part of the permanent record that would determine whether 8 years of fatherhood mattered more than biological connection and material advantage. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's science teacher, testified in a deposition that Sarah's attorney recorded for eventual court presentation. Marcus Bennett is the most engaged parent I've encountered in my career. He doesn't just attend conferences, he asks substantive questions about curriculum and how he can support Emma's learning at home. When Emma showed interest in environmental science, he found ways to make it real instead of abstract. The Riverfront project isn't Marcus using Emma's ideas, it's Marcus taking his daughter's interests seriously enough to incorporate them into meaningful work. Mrs. Patterson's testimony was simpler. That man raised that girl with more love than most two-parent households manage. He works hard, but he's never put work before Emma. I've watched him turn down opportunities that would have meant extra income because they conflicted with Emma's schedule. That's not instability, that's commitment. Ray's deposition happened at the garage, surrounded by tools and engines and the accumulated evidence of honest work. Marcus came to me 8 years ago needing a job that would let him be a father first and an employee second. I gave him that job because I saw something in him that reminded me of myself at that age before I learned that pride costs more than it's worth. He's never asked for special treatment, never used Emma as an excuse for poor work. He's just been present for both parts of his life in ways most men can't manage. The attorney questioning Ray tried to establish that Marcus's divided attention between garage and consulting work proved unreliability. 2 jobs means 2 sets of responsibilities he's failing to meet adequately. Ray's response carried the weight of 50 years watching men fail and succeed according to metrics that had nothing to do with job titles. 2 jobs means he's willing to work twice as hard to provide for his daughter while maintaining principles he could have compromised for easier money. That's not failure, that's character. Sarah's case grew more aggressive as the custody evaluation progressed. Her attorney filed motions claiming that Emma's behavioral issues at school stemmed from Marcus's inadequate supervision. They hired an expert witness, a child psychologist who'd never met Emma but was willing to testify that children needed mothers and that disrupting Emma's relationship with Sarah now would cause long-term psychological damage. Patricia countered with Emma's actual therapist, a woman named Dr. Lisa Freeman who'd been seeing Emma since the school fight that had triggered social services involvement. Emma's stress and acting out correlate directly with her mother's reappearance and the custody proceedings, Dr. Freeman testified. She has a secure attachment to her father built over 8 years of consistent presence. Disrupting that attachment to force a relationship with someone she doesn't know would be far more damaging than maintaining the stable environment she currently has. The battle lines were clear. Sarah offered material advantage and 2-parent stability. Marcus offered history and presence and the intangible architecture of relationship built from accumulated moments that couldn't be replicated or purchased. Dr. Cartwright's final evaluation report arrived 6 weeks after her initial visit. Patricia called Marcus to her office to review it before the final custody hearing, her expression suggesting the news wasn't entirely what they'd hoped for. "She found you to be a competent, engaged parent," Patricia began, which should have been good news but carried qualifications in the pause that followed. "However, she notes concerns about career instability and questions whether your current arrangement with Garrett and Associates is sustainable long-term." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "She thinks I should give up the consulting work. She thinks the dual commitments may eventually force choices that could affect Emma's stability. She's recommending shared custody with you, maintaining primary physical custody but Sarah getting substantial visitation time, including extended summer periods and alternating holidays. Emma doesn't want that." Patricia's expression carried the sympathy of someone who'd delivered worse news, but understood this still hurt. "Emma's preference is noted in the report, but Dr. Cartwright concludes that a relationship with her mother serves Emma's best interests regardless of her current wishes." The final custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. Marcus spent those weeks documenting every moment with Emma, every homework session and dinner conversation and bedtime story that proved their relationship was built on foundations that couldn't be replicated through court-ordered visitation schedules. Emma's stress manifested in nightmares that had her crawling into Marcus's bed at 2 in the morning, seeking comfort from fears she couldn't articulate but that weighed on her like buildings settling into unstable soil. "What if the judge makes me go?" she asked one night, her voice small in the darkness. Marcus pulled her close, felt her heartbeat against his chest, and wished he could promise her certainty instead of hope. "Then we'll deal with it together. But Emma, I need you to understand something. No matter what any judge says, you're my daughter. That doesn't change based on court orders or visitation schedules. I chose you when you were 2 days old, and I'm still choosing you every single day." The morning of the hearing arrived with rain that felt appropriate for the occasion. Marcus wore the same clothes he'd worn to the board meeting where he'd first exposed Derek's corruption. Business casual that felt like costume rather than comfort. Sarah arrived with Richard and her attorney, a woman named Catherine Mills who had a reputation for winning custody cases through aggressive tactics that prioritized victory over truth. Patricia had warned Marcus that Catherine would attack his character, his choices, his fitness as a parent in ways designed to make him defensive and angry. "Stay calm," Patricia had counseled. "Answer questions directly without elaborating. Don't let her provoke you into emotional responses that make you look unstable." Judge Henderson called the court to order and reviewed the evaluator's report with the careful attention of someone who understood that her decision would shape lives in ways that extended far beyond this courtroom. Catherine Mills went first, painting Sarah as a mother who'd made a mistake but had spent 8 years becoming the person Emma deserved. She emphasized Sarah's stable marriage, her financial security, her ability to provide opportunities that Marcus couldn't match. "Emma Bennett deserves a mother," Catherine argued. "She deserves the stability of a 2-parent household, the advantages of private education, the opportunities that come from financial security. Mr. Bennett has done admirable work as a single father, but admirable isn't the same as optimal." Patricia countered with 8 years of documentation. She called witnesses who testified to Marcus's consistent presence, his engagement with Emma's education, his sacrifice of career advancement to prioritize his daughter's needs. Mrs. Rodriguez testified, "Emma is thriving academically and socially because her father has created an environment that nurtures her natural curiosity while providing the structure she needs to feel secure." Dr. Freeman testified, "Disrupting Emma's primary attachment to her father would cause significant psychological harm. The relationship she has with Marcus is irreplaceable, built on thousands of small moments of trust and security." Catherine Mills cross-examined aggressively, trying to establish that Marcus's return to architecture proved his priorities were shifting away from Emma. "Isn't it true, Dr. Freeman, that Mr. Bennett is spending increasing amounts of time on professional pursuits that he abandoned 8 years ago specifically because they were incompatible with single parenting?" Dr. Freeman didn't flinch. "Mr. Bennett is consulting on a project that actively involves his daughter, that teaches her about environmental responsibility and the importance of standing by your principles even when it's difficult. That's not competing with parenting. That's modeling what it means to have integrity." The testimony continued through the morning and into early afternoon. Expert witnesses contradicting each other about what Emma needed, what stability meant, whether biological connection or accumulated presence mattered more in the architecture of family. Finally, Judge Henderson called Emma to testify. The courtroom fell silent as Emma took the stand, 10 years old and terrified but determined to speak truth, that adults were complicating beyond recognition. Catherine Mills questioned her gently, trying to establish that Emma would benefit from relationship with her mother regardless of her current resistance. "Don't you think it would be nice to have a mother? To have someone who can teach you things your father can't?" Emma's response was quiet but clear. "My dad teaches me everything I need to know. About buildings and how they work, about doing the right thing even when it's hard, about showing up for people even when you're tired. I don't need someone to teach me how to be rich. I need someone who chose me every day for 8 years." Catherine pressed, "But wouldn't you like to have opportunities your father can't provide? Piano lessons, private schools, travel to places you've never seen. I'd like to keep living with my dad, Emma said, her voice gaining strength. My mom left because she didn't want to be a mother. Now she's back because it's convenient or looks good or whatever. But my dad stayed. He gave up being famous to be my dad. That's not unstable, that's love. The courtroom absorbed this testimony like soil absorbing water, slowly, with effects that wouldn't be visible until much later. Patricia's closing argument focused on foundations, both literal and metaphorical. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about what we value in families. Ms. Bennett offers material advantages that are undeniable, but Mr. Bennett offers something that can't be purchased or replicated. 8 years of choosing his daughter over everything else that competed for his attention. He left a prestigious career to be present for her. He's turned down opportunities that would have meant more income because they conflicted with her needs. He's built a life where Emma is always the first priority, not an afterthought to be managed around professional ambition. She paused, let the words settle. The evaluator's report suggests that Mr. Bennett's current consulting work may eventually force difficult choices. But that misunderstands what we're seeing. Mr. Bennett isn't returning to architecture despite his daughter. He's finding a way to integrate his professional skills with his role as a father, to show Emma what it looks like to have principles and stand by them. The renewal project isn't competing with his parenting. It's an extension of the values he's teaching Emma every day. Catherine Mills's closing emphasized stability and opportunity and the court's obligation to consider Emma's best interests beyond her current wishes. Children can't always see what's best for them long term. Emma has been told her entire life that her mother abandoned her. Of course, she's resistant to building a relationship now. But with time and proper support, that relationship could provide benefits she can't currently imagine. This court has an obligation to look beyond a 10-year-old's current preferences to what will serve her best interests as she grows into adulthood. Judge Henderson took a recess to review the evidence before delivering her ruling. Marcus sat in the hallway with Emma and Patricia, waiting for a decision that would determine whether the past 8 years of sacrifice had been enough. Emma leaned against him, her weight familiar and precious. Whatever happens, you're still my dad. Always, Marcus promised, and meant it with every cell in his body. When court reconvened, Judge Henderson's expression gave nothing away. I've reviewed the evidence presented, the evaluator's report, and the testimony from all witnesses. This is not an easy case. Both parents offer legitimate advantages. Ms. Bennett provides financial stability and a 2-parent household. Mr. Bennett provides continuity and a demonstrated history of prioritizing his daughter's needs. She paused, and Marcus felt time stretch like structural steel under load, flexible up to a point and then catastrophically brittle. However, I'm struck by something Emma said in her testimony. She spoke about her father giving up being famous to be her dad, about him choosing her every day for 8 years. That consistency of choice, that pattern of prioritization, is the foundation of secure attachment. It cannot be replicated through court-ordered visitation or material advantage. Marcus felt his chest loosen slightly, hope creeping in through cracks in the armor he'd built against disappointment. I'm denying Ms. Bennett's petition for shared custody. Mr. Bennett will retain primary physical and legal custody. Ms. Bennett will have visitation rights graduated over the next year to allow Emma time to build a relationship at her own pace. But Emma's home is with her father, the parent who has been consistently present for her entire life. The relief that flooded through Marcus was so intense it felt physical, like buildings settling after earthquakes stopped shaking foundations that had somehow held, despite forces designed to tear them apart. Sarah was crying. Catherine Mills was already preparing appeals paperwork, but Marcus only had attention for Emma, who was looking at him with eyes that held entire futures suddenly possible again. Outside the courthouse, Patricia shook his hand, with satisfaction that came from winning fights that mattered. You built a strong case, Marcus. 8 years of documentation that proved you'd been exactly the parent Emma needed. It shouldn't have been a fight, Marcus said. Being present should be enough without needing to prove it. Ideally, yes, but we don't live in ideal circumstances. We live in the world we have and we fight with the tools available. Emma hugged him in the rain that was washing Portland clean, her arms tight around his waist like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "We won," she whispered. "We survived," Marcus corrected. "Now we get to keep building the life we already had." The renewal at Riverfront groundbreaking ceremony happened 6 weeks later on the first clear day after Portland's winter rain had finally surrendered to spring. City officials attended, environmental groups sent representatives. Architecture students from Portland State documented the event for case studies about regenerative development. Marcus stood with Sophia and Emma and the team that had transformed contaminated land into opportunity, watching construction equipment begin the work of healing soil that had been poisoned by decades of industrial neglect. The living foundation system would take months to install, each component carefully calibrated to support structures while actively remediating contamination. Emma's water gardens would follow, native plantings that would filter stormwater while providing habitat for species that had been driven out when the mill was operating. It would take years to complete. The bioremediation process would continue for decades. But when finished, the site would demonstrate that human development didn't have to destroy environments, that buildings could heal the land they occupied instead of merely extracting value from it. Sophia spoke to assembled media about the project's vision, about the importance of holding developers accountable for environmental impact, about how the corruption that had nearly derailed renewal actually made the full product more meaningful. "We were going to build luxury housing on contaminated land while pretending the contamination didn't exist," she said. "Thanks to someone having the courage to speak truth that was inconvenient and expensive, we're now building something that actually matters, something that will clean the soil while providing homes, that will educate future generations while healing past damage." Reporters asked Marcus about the transition from mechanic to lead consultant on Portland's most innovative development project. He kept his answers brief, uncomfortable with a tension that suggested individual heroism rather than collective effort. "I'm not a hero. I'm someone who couldn't stay silent when I saw people about to make decisions that would hurt families who trusted them. The real innovation here isn't the technology we're using. It's the willingness to prioritize what's right over what's profitable." Emma cut the ceremonial ribbon, her smile bright enough to power the educational center that would eventually teach students about environmental stewardship and regenerative architecture. Cameras captured the moment. 10-year-old girl with dirt under her fingernails and vision beyond her years, representing futures that depended on adults having courage to build correctly instead of quickly. After the ceremony, Marcus and Emma walked the site together, marking where her water gardens would eventually flow, imagining the buildings that would rise on foundations designed to heal rather than merely support. "Dad, do you think the contamination will really go away?" Marcus knelt beside her, scooped soil that still carried traces of chemicals from decades past. "Not completely. Not in our lifetimes, but it will get better. Cleaner. Safer. The bacteria in the foundation will eat the petroleum compounds. The plants will absorb heavy metals. Slowly, over years and decades, this land will heal." "Like how we healed," Emma said, "after Mom left." The observation hit Marcus with unexpected force. "Yeah, like that." They stood together watching construction crews prepare the site. Father and daughter who had survived custody battles and career transitions and all the ways life tested foundations to find their breaking points. That evening, Marcus returned to the Iron Post for the first time since the custody hearing had consumed all available emotional bandwidth. The bar looked the same, smelled the same, but Marcus felt different entering it now, like he'd crossed some threshold that changed how he occupied space. Sophia was already there, occupying their usual spot with 2 whiskeys waiting. Figured you'd show up eventually. Marcus sat, accepted the drink, let the familiar burn settle into his chest like homecoming. Congratulations on the groundbreaking. The media coverage was phenomenal. Thanks to you, Sophia said. If you hadn't exposed Derek's corruption, we'd be building luxury housing on poisoned land and pretending we didn't know better. You would have found out eventually. Maybe. But how many families would have bought homes before we did? How many lives would we have damaged because we chose profit over truth? They drank in comfortable silence, letting the bar's ambient noise fill spaces where conversation wasn't necessary. Finally, Sophia spoke. I want to offer you a permanent position. Director of Sustainable Development. Lead every project where environmental remediation is required. Build what you've always been capable of building. The offer sat between them like plans for structures that could change skylines if someone had courage to construct them. I'm still working at Hayes Auto 3 days a week. Keep working there. I'm not asking you to choose between worlds anymore. I'm asking you to integrate them in ways that make both stronger. Marcus thought about Ray and the garage and the satisfaction that came from solving mechanical problems that had clear solutions. Thought about Emma and the promises he'd made to always prioritize her above professional ambition. Thought about buildings rising on healing ground and foundations that supported weight while cleaning soil beneath them. I need to think about it. Sophia nodded, understanding that some decisions required time to settle into shapes that felt right rather than merely possible. The months that followed brought changes that Marcus navigated with the caution of someone who'd learned that foundations needed time to cure before bearing full loads. He continued working at Hayes Auto, continued consulting on renewal, continued building a life where his daughter remained the central structural element around which everything else was designed. Emma thrived in the aftermath of the custody hearing, her stress evaporating like water from properly ventilated foundations. She visited Sarah monthly and supervised sessions that gradually became less supervised as relationship built slowly from shared genetics towards something that might eventually resemble connection. Sarah remained a peripheral presence, someone who sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts and occasional emails about Emma's achievements, but never quite graduated from stranger to mother in ways that mattered. Emma was polite but distant, willing to maintain relationship but unwilling to pretend 8 years of absence could be erased by present attempts at involvement. The renewal project progressed according to timelines that prioritized quality over speed. The living foundation system exceeded performance expectations. The bacteria metabolizing petroleum compounds faster than models had predicted. Emma's water gardens took shape, native plantings establishing themselves with the resilience of species adapted to Portland's climate. Architecture journals featured the project as example of what was possible when developers prioritized environmental healing over maximum profit extraction. Other cities reached out requesting consultation on similar brownfield remediation projects. Marcus found himself traveling occasionally, Emma accompanying him when school schedules allowed, learning about regenerative development by watching theory become reality. Ray retired at 70, sold Hayes Auto to Marcus for a price that recognized 8 years of loyalty more than market value. Marcus kept the name, kept the culture, added environmental retrofitting to services offered because automotive repair and sustainable building design shared more principles than people realized. 1 year after the groundbreaking, the first residential units at Renewal opened for occupancy. Families moved into homes built on foundations that were actively cleaning contaminated soil. Units designed to minimize environmental impact while maximizing quality of life. The educational center welcomed its first students, children learning about environmental stewardship from someone who'd helped transform poisoned land into healing ground. Emma, now 11 and taller than seemed possible, cut another ribbon at the educational center's opening. Cameras captured her explaining water garden design to reporters who were starting to recognize her as integral to the project rather than just the consultant's daughter. That evening, Marcus found her at her desk working on homework that had become more sophisticated than he could easily assist with, her mind moving toward futures he could barely imagine. "Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez says I should think about applying to MIT when I'm older, for their environmental engineering program." Marcus felt something complicated move through his chest. Pride and fear and recognition that he was raising someone who would eventually leave to build her own architecture in places he couldn't follow. "That's 8 years away, sweetheart, but if it's what you want, we'll figure out how to make it happen." Emma nodded, returned to her homework, and Marcus stood in her doorway watching her work the same way he'd watched her sleep when she was 2. And the world felt like it might collapse under the weight of single parenthood. But they'd survived. More than survived. They'd built something that lasted, foundations strong enough to bear weight from every direction while remaining flexible enough to adapt when circumstances demanded it. Later, at his drafting table, Marcus sketched buildings he might actually construct now instead of merely imagining, structures that healed the land they occupied, developments that demonstrated what was possible when integrity mattered more than expedience. Architecture that his daughter might someday improve upon because he'd shown her that buildings should serve more than just the people living in them. Sophia called at 11 with news that the board had approved funding for 3 additional regenerative development projects, all requiring the kind of expertise Marcus had spent 8 years pretending he didn't possess. "They want you to lead all 3. Full-time position. Salary that would let you sell the garage if you wanted to." Marcus thought about Ray and Hayes Auto and the part of himself that still needed grease under his fingernails and problems that could be solved with socket wrenches and persistence. "I'll take the projects, but I'm keeping the garage. Some things matter more than money." Sophia laughed, the sound carrying relief and something that might have been affection, if they'd ever decided to name what existed between them. "You're impossible. You knew that when you hired me." They talked for an hour about foundation systems and remediation timelines and the slow, patient work of healing land that humans had poisoned through decades of not caring about consequences beyond quarterly profits. Eventually, conversation drifted toward personal territory they'd been circling for months without directly addressing. "Emma asked me if we were dating," Marcus admitted. "I didn't know how to answer." "What did you tell her?" "That we're friends who happen to be building something meaningful together." She said that sounded like dating with extra steps. Sophia's silence carried weight that Marcus could feel through the phone connection. "She's not wrong." "No," Marcus agreed. "She's not. So what do we do about it?" Marcus thought about foundations and the importance of letting concrete cure before applying full loads. About the difference between structures built quickly that failed early and structures built correctly that lasted generations. "We keep building, slowly, making sure the foundations are solid before we add weight they might not be ready to support." "That's very architectural of you." "It's the only way I know how to approach things that matter." They said goodnight with promises to discuss project timelines in the morning, but both understood they'd really been discussing something more fundamental than construction schedules. 2 years after the custody hearing, 3 years after Marcus had stood in the iron post and exposed corruption that nearly destroyed Sophia's company, the renewal at Riverfront won the American Institute of Architects Award for Environmental Innovation. The ceremony happened in Washington, D.C. at a conference that brought together architects and developers from across the country to celebrate buildings that pushed the profession forward. Marcus attended with Emma and Sophia, the 3 of them representing partnership that had started with whiskey and honesty and had grown into something that looked surprisingly like family without anyone having decided to name it that. Emma, now 12 and starting to resemble the young woman she was becoming more than the child she'd been, stood on stage accepting the award alongside Marcus and Sophia. Her speech was brief but carried conviction that made adults uncomfortable. My dad taught me that you can't build something to last if you ignore what's beneath it. That's true for buildings, it's true for lives. The renewal project works because we didn't pretend the contamination didn't exist. We acknowledged it and designed systems that would heal it. That's what integrity looks like in architecture. That's what it should look like everywhere. The audience applauded, and Marcus watched his daughter navigate attention with poise he'd never possessed at 12 or 20 or 40. She'd grown up watching him choose principle over convenience, watching him sacrifice career advancement for her well-being, watching him stand by commitments even when easier paths were available. Now she was becoming someone who would make those same choices, but from a foundation he'd helped build rather than having to construct it from rubble the way he'd been forced to do. After the ceremony, Emma wanted to explore the National Mall, see the monuments and museums that turned American history into marble and bronze. They walked together, the three of them, past the Lincoln Memorial and the Vietnam Wall and the Washington Monument, reaching towards sky that was finally clearing after days of rain. "Dad," Emma said as they stood before the reflecting pool, "do you ever regret leaving architecture the first time? All those years you could have been building instead of fixing cars?" Marcus thought about the question, about the buildings he'd never constructed and the blueprints that had remained theoretical, and the career trajectory he'd abandoned for lunches cut into triangles and bedtime stories and promises kept. "Not for a second," he said. "Those years built you. Nothing I could have designed would have mattered more than that." Emma nodded, satisfied, and they continued walking through monuments to leaders who'd made choices that shaped nations. Marcus had made smaller choices, decisions that affected only one life directly, but that life contained futures he could barely imagine and wouldn't trade for all the skyscrapers ever built. That evening, after Emma was asleep in their hotel room, Marcus and Sophia sat on the balcony watching DC's lights spread across darkness like constellation maps of human ambition. "She's remarkable," Sophia said. "You should be proud." "I am. Terrified, too. She's going to leave eventually, build her own life in places I can't follow. That's what good parenting produces, people capable of leaving because they're secure enough to risk it." Marcus nodded, understanding the truth in words that still hurt to acknowledge. Sophia's hand found his across the small distance between their chairs. "For what it's worth, you don't have to navigate that alone. Whatever this is between us, whatever we're building, I'm committed to seeing it through." Marcus turned his hand to intertwine their fingers, the gesture feeling both new and inevitable, like foundations finally bearing the weight they'd been designed to support. "I'm not good at this," he admitted. "The relationship part, Chip. I dedicated 8 years to being Emma's father. Didn't leave much room for anything else. I'm not asking for anything else. I'm asking to be part of what already exists, to build something alongside what you've already built rather than competing with it." They sat in silence, watching the city breathe below them. Two people who'd started as strangers in a bar and had become something neither had planned but both were willing to protect. The future stretched ahead, uncertain as contaminated soil before remediation, full of potential damage and possible healing depending on whether people had courage to build correctly instead of quickly. Marcus had learned that lesson 8 years ago when Emma arrived and Sarah left, had relearned it when Derek's corruption forced choices between principle and convenience. Now he was learning it again, understanding that some foundations took decades to cure but lasted generations once they'd settled into their final form. In a world where everyone rushed to prove their worth through noise and performance, he'd built his life on quieter principles. Show up, do the work, choose what matters even when easier options exist, build things that heal rather than merely extract. Some men construct empires that crumble when tested. Others build legacies that last because they're founded on bedrock deeper than ambition or profit, or the desperate need for validation. Marcus had chosen the second path without really choosing it, had stumbled into fatherhood and found it was the only architecture that really mattered, the only blueprint worth following regardless of cost or consequence. Emma slept in the next room, dreaming futures he'd helped make possible. Sophia sat beside him, planning developments that would heal poisoned ground, and Marcus understood finally that the strongest structures weren't the ones that reached highest toward sky, but the ones that went deepest into earth, anchored in foundations strong enough to support whatever weight came pressing down.